Two and a Half Admins, episode 201. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. High-severity vulnerabilities affect a wide range of Asus router models.
So Asus has come out with some updates to address some of these. I'm releasing these critical patch updates. The first one, the CVE 2024-3080, is an authentication bypass, which would allow a remote attacker to log into a device without having to provide a username and password. So the first question is, why is remote login enabled? But the second one is, why are you building authentication systems that, just guessing here, have too much of the authentication done in the JavaScript rather than in the back end of the web interface?
My answer for that one, which was wildly unpopular in the R's comments section, was, it's Asus, y'all. This is the same company that built routers with unauthenticated FTP servers open to the WAN that would expose everything on any thumb drive or USB portable you plugged into that router to the entire internet, read-write for everyone. And even when that was reported to them, said, no, that's not a flaw. That's awesome. You should love that. By the way, keep plugging your stuff into it. There was a court order that came out of that particular issue, which was 10 years ago almost to the day, that forced them to accept third-party security mediation for a certain number of years. I'm not sure if that's up yet or not. And a lot of folks seem to have taken that as like, oh, well, that just got everything sorted with Asus. And I'm like, nah, man, that didn't make them security focused any more than the Philip Morris and RJ Reynolds companies having to put out anti-smoking ads made them actually concerned for the health of your lungs.
Yeah. And, we've also talked about on the show 8 or 9 months ago, probably, about the US Cyber Trust certification and trying to get to the point where all routers pass some minimum standard of security before people go buying them, or at least giving the consumer some ability to tell how well tested a router is before they buy it, and that could factor into their purchase decision. But that's not up and running yet. And again, I think we'll come down to some level of, what are the testing that's going to go into this? And there will be a test to make sure that you can't get unauthenticated access, but it's not going to be able to find every bug. So even when we have some level of certification, or like in this case, Jim was saying, even if they have to get the stuff audited, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have found all the problems. It just means that at least they did some level of something, but I think we have to keep working to continue to raise that bar.
It sounds like this isn't just a bit of sloppy code that led to some sort of buffer overflow or something. This sounds like more of a design failure from what you have speculated, at least.
Probably. Like authentication bypass means, there was some way to do stuff without having to log in, which means on the back end, when it checks, are you logged in? Sometimes it just doesn't check. And that can just be, in the web UI, you can only get to that page if you are logged in. It's like, but if I know the URL and I just type it in my browser, can I go to it? Then that's not authenticated.
This may be another wildly unpopular idea, but it occurs to me to wonder, have we gotten to the point where you really shouldn't be allowed to just sell whatever you care to sell as a router, regardless of what feature set you've enabled or how you've set it up, and just let normal people go out and put it on the internet? You can't just take anything out onto the public roads where there are other people. Maybe we should have some similar standards with third-party testing, not just relying on the companies making these things. Maybe there really ought to be some regulations that define, like, this is what a consumer router is. It must do these things. It must not do these things. And somebody other than the company making it's going to test it and make sure that's the case.
Yeah, although I think that's where you get into, there are regulations about what you can call chocolate. And so many food products are now labeled chocolate flavored. Because no, it's not a router. It's a home media something device that then evades the requirement. But I think having that would at least, again, like we were talking about, give consumers something to look for, to know that I'm getting something that's at least some level of a second set of eyes have looked at it, compared to I have to go on faith with the manufacturer because no manufacturer has never had a flaw.
Are you trying to say that we need to regulate the capitalism again, Jim?
Always, but it's not really about the capitalism specifically, right now. I don't think anybody would argue this is not a capitalist society or a free market, because you have to have a driver's license and, there are rules about what you can or can't call a car that can drive on public roads.
You'd be surprised there are some people who would argue that, Jim.
I know there are some, but you're talking about a very, very fringe minority at this point, and I'm just going to go ahead and ignore the sovereign citizens of the world. We don't need to elevate them. But it occurs to me that, we have very clearly reached a point where there are legitimate public safety concerns from screwing up the ways people are connected to the internet, because in the more developed economies in the world in 2024, a huge amount of any normal citizen's life happens online, period. Like it can't be worked around. So if you're going to have something that is, literally a part of daily life for everybody in your country, then yeah, safety regulations start to sound kind of important. And right now we essentially have none.
My only concern there is if it's something, like you have to get the safety certification on your car before you can drive it on the road, makes sense. But how many of us have our router type device is a homemade thing that there's not some manufacturer that can pay to get it certified? I wouldn't want to get to the point where you can't plug any device into the internet unless it's been certified.
I'm actually more focused on what you need to do in order to sell a device as something. Like if you're a hobbyist and you want to build your own router out of, whatever the crap in your own house, fine. That's a relatively small issue. You're talking about a vanishingly small minority of the internet's population will actually do that. What's really important is, what's going out to literally hundreds of millions of households of people who are not, cannot, and will not build their own router or whatever, but they should be able to go down to a store and say, I would like a router, please, and be given a thing with a reliable set of features and security and privacy concerns that everybody understands this is what this means.
Yeah. And, while you're at it, maybe they could have ratings about bandwidth on them that are actually legitimate, like tested by a third party in normal internet circumstances, not the numbers they print on the Wi-Fi where it's like, oh, up to magical numbers. So that you get a router that has enough CPU horsepower to actually pass your gigabit internet through it over the wire. We're not even talking about the Wi-Fi side of that and so on. But then at that point, you might as well also ask for a pony while you're at it.
I think as far as speed certifications on routers go, you could certainly have like minimum metrics as part of the spec to be able to sell it as a consumer router, or you could even maybe have like 2 or 3 grades of router, but it would have to be like a bronze, silver, gold kind of a deal, because to really talk about what the router is capable of doing, you can't just talk about bandwidth. You got to start talking about packets per second. And you're never going to get normal people to understand the difference between a high packet per second, workflow and a large packets, few of them, but enormous amounts of bandwidth. And what a given router can manage out of the two is going to be very different.
Yeah. Because, it would definitely be packets per second. Because if your router can't saturate with big, juicy packets, then it's completely inept. But yeah, I see your point there.
But you're going to have some manufacturers that want to go platinum because gold won't be good enough for them.
Sure. But that also gets to the point of maybe America needs to actually classify what broadband is in similar terms and stop calling 25 megabits down broadband and so on. Anyway, there's a couple other CVEs in the article, 243079, which if an attacker already manages to get administrative access, they can execute remote commands and do whatever they want to your router, probably even modify things. And a third vulnerability, 2024-3912, allows remote attackers to execute commands with no user authentication required. So again, almost an authentication bypass, except for they can run whatever commands they want instead of just use the web interface. And that also carries a severity rating of 9.8 out of 10. And they have a list of the devices they fixed it for, but also a note here that this also affects a number of Asus router models that are no longer supported by the manufacturer and will not be patched. The Commuter Emergency Response Center advises owners of those devices to replace them. And that maybe gets to Jim's point that if you do buy a router device that passes some certification, maybe it should also have a guaranteed lifetime of so many years, or say on the box that this device has a best before date, like your smoke detector, and when it's past that date, it's time to get rid of it and get a new one. Not that I want to force there to be even more e-waste.
Yeah, it should be updatable. Surely. I mean, at some point, it's going to not have the hardware for the software features that you need.
Right. At some point, the software company has to be able to stop being burdened by it. But
there should be a reasonable length of time, like 10 years, say.
I think 10 is not reasonable. I think anything over 5 and you're getting awfully hard to try to continue to support something with the amount stuff changes.
It's probably worth pointing out stuff doesn't have to change at, that heavier rate. When we look at like Linux, for example, I mean, Linux has been, and FreeBSD for that matter, have been updatable in place on the same hardware for well over a decade each. Now, that doesn't really translate to consumer routers because the consumer routers need to be smaller and cheaper, but there's not really anything preventing a manufacturer from standardizing to a degree and saying, we're going to make the effort to have a set design spec for our devices so that even when we upgrade our hardware, we can still have, the same operating system installed on the whole family. That's not generally the decision that manufacturers make. But again, when you look at the PC market, it is clearly possible and it's consumer friendly.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Tailscale. Go to tailscale.com/25A. Tailscale is an intuitive, programmable way to manage a private network. It's zero-trust network access that every organization can use, and with Tailscale's ACL policies, you can securely control access to devices and services with next-gen network access controls. Loads of the late-night Linux family hosts use Tailscale for all sorts, including controlling 3D printers, remoting into their relative systems for support, controlling Home Assistant, and sending ZFS snapshots to off-site backup locations. I got it set up in minutes, and you can too. So support the show and check out Tailscale for yourself. Go to tailscale.com/25A and try out Tailscale for free for up to 100 devices and 3 users with no credit card required. That's tailscale.com/25A. Microsoft, to remove direct access from Windows, recommends switching to always-on VPN.
Now, the cool thing about this one is, I imagine most of our listeners are going, wait a minute, what the hell's direct access? Am I going to miss that when it's gone? Matter of fact, that was my initial reaction when I saw this bit of news, and I had to read in and be like, oh, that's what Microsoft's calling their crappy software VPN these days. So I don't think it's probably very directly interesting for many people that Microsoft is removing their built-in Windows VPN because nobody was using it in the first place. However, I do find it pretty interesting that Microsoft has been attempting to provide some form of software VPN. Remember the L2 VPNs, back in the early 2000s?
Mm-hmm.
For, like 20 years now. And they have failed to make a single one that anybody with any sense wanted to use. I've seen Windows software RAID in the wild more frequently than I've seen Windows VPNs. And that's really saying something.
Yeah. And I had honestly never heard of this direct access thing. And they're talking about it having IP over HTTPS. It's like, I don't know of any other VPNs that offer that in particular, because that could be interesting in very lockdown environments. Like, when you're on hostile Wi-Fi that doesn't allow anything that's not on port 443 kind of thing. But usually they don't actually, because it's encrypted, can't actually understand if what you're speaking over 443 is actually HTTPS or not. So it probably also doesn't make that much sense.
I beg to differ on that one. I have seen a lot of small government offices with Cisco routers that are doing, I don't know the technical details, but whatever deep packet inspection they're doing is sufficient to tell the difference between, for example, OpenVPN on TCP 443 and HTTPS on TCP 443. Yes, they know the difference, and they will stop the OpenVPN every time.
Well, yes, you can at least look for the
handshake packets.
When you send the client hello with the certificate name exposed so that the web server can do the right thing. What's that called? SNI, server name indication.
Yeah, ultimately it boils down to, you have to initiate at least a proper HTTPS. Now, you wouldn't necessarily have to do a VPN with any kind of real initiation because you could be relying on pre-shared keys. But for HTTPS, you have to do the initial connection to some degree in the clear, enough for a router to know what the heck it is. And that is enough that commercial VPN firewall manufacturers have absolutely included deep packet inspection features that will stop a VPN on TCP 443. Now, if you're actually encapsulating over HTTPS, no, there's nothing you can really do about that, short of blocking by IP endpoint. And I have seen some techniques for doing that, but that usually gets treated as like seriously sketchy because there are such performance implications for trying to tunnel an entire network flow inside HTTPS that basically if you're willing to do that in the first place, oh, you're doing something dirty. You're trying to get by some admin somewhere that does not want you to do what you're doing.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of the whole detecting and disabling DNS over HTTPS by actually every time you see a request, you make a DNS over HTTPS request of the same thing. And if it replies, you know it's a DNS server. And you're like, nope, block it. You're going to use my damn DNS on my network or get the fuck out.
It kind of surprises me that Microsoft hasn't worked with Jason Donenfeld to build some kind of a really friendly, really like well-integrated GUI for WireGuard connections. If you had support for that all the way up into the desktop layer of an operating system, you could make it insanely easy to set up point-to-point encrypted connections between arbitrary systems, and that seems like it'd be a huge value add. It's not like Microsoft doesn't know what WireGuard is. I know that, members of their team were assisting Jason when he was figuring out, how to handle the Windows network stack in the best way. And it blows my mind that a company the size of Microsoft would spend 20 years failing to build a VPN and then just leave that opportunity lying on the table.
I wonder if some of that has to do with how many commercial ones are out there and what would it mean for the Windows app ecosystem if every time you made a really good app, Microsoft just built it into Windows and took your market from you? Kind of like what Twitter was doing pre-Musk, where they would sometimes be like, oh, we really like the functionality you've built with our API, so we're going to build it in and cut you off. Looking at the number of VPN clients installed on my work laptop, because every customer uses a different damn VPN thing. I wish everything just used WireGuard, but a lot of them use all kinds of other stuff. I suppose the other thing is WireGuard doesn't really have any kind of support for MFA to be able to connect. But it seems like you could implement it on the client side, encrypt the private key and require MFA to access it. But I guess there's nothing really stopping it from the server side either, except for WireGuard is really kind of connectionless. Like you don't actually initiate a connection. You just send packets and they either are allowed or not. It's part of the reason why it's so hard to debug WireGuard the odd time it isn't working, because you just get no errors, but no success. And you're just left there wondering. And that's partly on purpose so that somebody can't try to brute force WireGuard because they can't tell when it's working. But I'm just wondering how we could do 2FA from the server side of WireGuard. Although part of that is WireGuard technically doesn't have a server side. It's all peer-to-peer. It's just by convention that one side is often actually a server.
So we're starting to tread on some ticklish territory here because Tailscale is a sponsor of this show. Thanks, Tailscale. And, one of the implications of what I've been talking about with the idea that, Microsoft could just build in a really neat WireGuard wrapper, the other piece of that would be Microsoft could add in, relatively cheap back-end cloud functionality to allow people who weren't capable of, or knowledgeable enough to do port forwarding on routers to instantly just connect any two machines arbitrarily, using Microsoft's network as the back-end to introduce two machines and do a stunnel or whatever. This would all be like really trivial, and it would, again, be an incredible value add. And, one just wonders, why didn't they do it? Obviously, that would suck for Tailscale.
Yeah, well, I think Microsoft, especially for so long before now, I don't know how much is changing, has relied on this entire ecosystem of third-party applications, right? Like Microsoft was a pretty basic OS with not much in it, and it depended on these third-party applications to actually make it a useful ecosystem.
And how many of those did Microsoft just immediately purchase and consume when it saw they were getting popular?
Yeah, or replace, like with the antivirus thing. Like Defender is just basically rendered all antivirus obsolete, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I can see the case for doing that with VPN again, because the reason to do it with the antivirus is the antiviruses were generally not doing that good of a job, and they just didn't have the ability to force the update the way Microsoft does. At least in the past for Microsoft, it was touchy territory to keep shooting your partners in the kneecaps, because the ecosystem depended on those partners to build the rest of the apps that, that catalog of apps is what kept people using Windows instead of just going to alternative operating systems. And so if you acquire them, maybe that's one thing. But if you just make a competing thing and put them out of business, then that's quite hostile. And if you do that too many times, then other people aren't going to continue to build for your ecosystem. Whereas Microsoft, especially now looking at this transition to ARM, That's why they came out with the Microsoft Dev Kit hardware, being like, all right, ecosystem, we're going to give you this much under cost ARM device that you can buy and start building your apps so that when Windows on ARM came out, that there would be apps available for it from day one.
You could have just said developers there, Alan.
Probably.
Yeah, and I think it's valid to say that there are reasons to want a healthy, thriving third-party app ecosystem and to be worried about upsetting that apple cart. I'm just not sure you can argue that Microsoft gives a shit about that with a straight face. I mean, in 1987, Microsoft bought Forethought, which developed a presentation program that would later be known as PowerPoint. In 97, Microsoft bought Hotmail. In 99, Microsoft tried to buy Nintendo. Now, Nintendo just laughed at them, but they gave it a shot. Let's see here. Bought Visio in 2000, which was competing, directly with Office suites.
Exactly. When you buy the company, at least you're paying for that, right? But when you make a competing thing and just drive them out of business, that's considered much more hostile to the companies that are thinking about designing for your ecosystem. A lot of companies will design specifically to get acquired by Microsoft. That's the whole business model. But to end up having Microsoft steal your market from you and leave you to wither and die, that's not a good business model.
You don't think Microsoft has done lots and lots of that too?
Well, I'm sure they have. I'm just saying they don't want to get the reputation for doing it too much.
I hear what you're saying. It feels like you've drawn an arbitrary line that I'm not sure Microsoft actually sees.
Maybe. Because you're right. It's not like they've just refused to do VPNs. They've just always done them badly.
Yeah, but it wouldn't take them much to build a team to take on something like Tailscale, would it? They've got enough money to do it.
Now, Tailscale has competitive advantages in that it's not only for Windows and so on, but I think it would definitely suck for a bunch of VPN companies if Microsoft just made something that was actually good enough that people wouldn't want to have other VPN software.
Are we going to pretend now that Microsoft would be incapable of bringing that support to whatever operating system platform they chose? I mean, they're doing an awful lot of Linux contribution these days.
Yeah, and a team to port it to Mac and iOS wouldn't be that expensive for them in the grand scheme of things.
I mean, if we got VS Code on Linux, I really don't think, they're this hypothetical Tailscale equivalent, them producing a backend for it for Linux does not seem like it would be much of a stretch.
No, not at all.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Automox. Are you prepared for whatever shitstorm may hit your desk during the workday? Automox has your back. Check out the brand new Autonomous IT podcast. Listen in as various IT experts discuss the latest Patch Tuesday releases, mitigation tips, and custom automations to help with CVE remediations. Make new work friends. Listen now to the Autonomous IT podcast on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you tune into your podcasts. Quick bit of admin then. Thank you everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Recently, there was a fairly serious CVE in Windows Wi-Fi drivers.
Yeah, so this is CVE 2024-30078, which is a Wi-Fi driver remote code execution hole. It's rated as an 8.8 severity, although I guess it's a different rating agency than the previous story we were talking about. Currently is not publicly disclosed and not known to be under attack or exploitation, but an unauthenticated attacker could send a malicious networking packet to an adjacent system that is employing a Wi-Fi network adapter, which could enable remote code execution. So that's basically anyone within Wi-Fi distance of your laptop could send a packet that your laptop would misinterpret and run the code contained in that packet.
And this bug hits every supported version of Windows, just to be clear.
Yeah. If you look at the CVE, it's hitting Windows kernels back to like 6.x, which is Windows 7, basically? It includes Windows Server 2008, which came out before Windows 7.
So it could potentially be even earlier then.
Yeah. And while they've released fixes for all the supported versions, and if you pay them the millions of dollars for the extended support, it sounds like they've released fixes for the older ones, because it sounds like it might be the same bit of code across all the versions. It's not necessarily something newer, but this hits every supported version of Windows, and it's zero touch. Basically, you don't have to click anything or agree to anything or open a link or open an attachment. This is just your laptop went near a bad machine and got poisoned. There's a couple of other CVEs in the batch. I think there's 49 in total for Microsoft. And article also happens to mention there's 166 from Adobe. But other Microsoft ones, including one that affects DNSSEC and another one that affects the Microsoft message queuing system, which has a 9.8 out of 10 severity and basically says, check your network and ensure that TCP port 1801 is not reachable, because if it is, the machine could be exploited.
But don't worry, Microsoft says that it will prioritize security over AI. So they're going to get right on this, and this won't ever happen again.
Pull the ninth leg. It's got bells on, given that we're talking about AI.
I've lost count of how many times Microsoft says that. But in this case, I'm guessing maybe they mean that they're going to consider security when developing new things, rather than be like, no, everybody's going to want screenshots of their machine OCR'd and saved in an SQLite database on their disk every second all the time, so that it's really easy to steal people's passwords.
I've talked a lot of crap about Microsoft so far this episode, but I will say this. The messaging that I've seen and the levels that the messaging has come from, up to and including Satya Nadella himself, I believe that Microsoft is aware that at the very least, it needs to look like it's taking security seriously indeed for another few months at minimum. Now, does that necessarily mean that I think that the actual top priority is security? Well, no, I don't really have a strong opinion on that one way or the other. It's really hard to get that level of information out of just public-focused messaging. But I do think that they're not going to publicly about-face that quickly.
Yes, and I'll also say that this story actually has less to do with the backlash around the recall AI stuff and more to do with the hearings in the Senate happening at the moment related to the security incidents at Microsoft a couple of months ago, where people infiltrated the Exchange servers and were stealing all kinds of people's emails and so on. China-linked hackers stole 60,000 U.S. State Department emails and so on. And so when Microsoft gets called before Congress, then suddenly they actually start promising to take security seriously.
Yeah, it's all right for you and me to have our data compromised by shitty Microsoft security. But when it happens to the government, they get a bit serious about it.
Well, this is more when Microsoft's cloud is not going to be allowed to be used by the government because the government doesn't think it's safe enough, suddenly they're going to start caring about it.
And they're especially going to start caring about it when we're in our current situation, which has, in my opinion, just kind of a disturbing level of integration between the government and, the various cloud services, the Microsofts and whatnot, the Oracle, you name it out there. These really large tech companies have started doing a lot of what traditionally would have been government work to be performed by government employees. But as we have defederated, formerly open standards and made larger and larger incentives to centralize everything inside the essentially private, really. I mean, we call them public clouds, but, clouds that are managed directly by these tech giants. Well, yeah, it starts to be an issue of like, if none of them take things any more seriously, there won't be anywhere to actually handle government business online, which is a huge problem.
Well, Cory Doctorow recently wrote a post, Microsoft pinky swears that this time they'll make security a priority. And it really is a greatest hits of Microsoft just being shit, basically, and just being a terrible company. And it almost makes me sympathize with those people who will never, ever forgive Microsoft. Those Linux users that are like, no, I don't care that they love Linux now. Just look at the history.
I think it's fair to never love Microsoft. I don't think it makes sense to imagine that Microsoft is a completely unchanging monolith, no different now than it was in the late 1990s. That's ridiculous. It's a different company because, it's multiple decades later and it's different people there and different policies. But what it's never going to be is an open source organization in the way that we all think of open source software. It's never going to share our priorities. It's a for-profit corporation, and it will deal with our priorities when it thinks that makes it more money. And it has learned that, it needs to deal with us a certain degree or it will endanger the money flow. But that's as far as it goes.
Well, because I would say even there, like, your Red Hats and your Canonicals and so on are also commercial entities. They have slightly more incentive to focus on the open source parts, but no more requirement to do so than Microsoft does.
As we have seen a little bit of since the IBM acquisition of Red Hat.
Yep.
And as no doubt we will see even more of as and when Canonical IPOs, if they ever get around to it.
Assuming Microsoft doesn't just purchase them outright.
Who knows? We've speculated for a decade or more at this point. But yeah, Microsoft is a company full of people, and there are whole teams there that are great folks who really love open source. But then there are other people higher up, probably, who don't necessarily love open source or love the money that they can make from it, but don't necessarily care about any of the sort of underlying principles that we care about.
At the end of the day, it's a group of tens of thousands of individual humans, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the way it always works. You get tens of thousands of people. Some of them are going to be great blokes. Some of them are going to absolutely suck, and you'd like to throw them off the nearest cliff. And a lot of the time, some of the ones who absolutely suck the worst, part of the reason they suck so bad is because they're just monomaniacally focused on getting to the top and making number go up and maximizing their everything and minimizing everybody else's. And name me any collection of tens of thousands of human beings where that's not what it looks like. If we had a soundboard, this is when it would be time to play the cricket loop.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.